DIYers, what's going on? Mike Boards with the Mike Boards channel. Thank you for watching. We're talking boats today. We're going to show you how to properly and safely remove your gimbal bearing. Let's get started. DIYers, here we are at the Craftsman workstation, and again we're going to show you how to remove your gimbal bearing, and the only tool we recommend to use when removing your gimbal bearing. And we have been busy. On the left hand side you can see our outdrive on the stand, and it has been completely rebuilt, upper and lower and everything in between. However, back to the gimbal bearing, let's take a closer look. And here is the gimbal bearing removal tool. Again, the only tool we recommend using. And down below in the comment section as well as description section will be a link on where to purchase this. And first glance, not much to it. And that blue sleeve acts as a protector for the thread of this entire shaft. And the tip portion is what will be shifted down the U-joint bellow area and inside the gimbal housing. And each side has machine lips on it, and that actually will go through the gimbal bearing and grab a hold of it to allow you to grip onto it and pull it out. I reposition the camera, and this is the plate that we are going to position on the bell housing. The studs will go through these little slots here. And that little circular threaded insert is where the shaft goes through and screws through to apply that tension or pressure on the gimbal bearing itself. And this little rod portion is installed. I can pull that out, and basically the tip can be compressed. You can barely see me compressing that tip. And again, that has a lip machine cut into it to allow it to go through the gimbal and grab a hold of it and pull it out. And the cool thing about this rod is once you get this through the gimbal bearing, you use this rod to push out, and it extends the tip, allowing the machine cut portion of this tip to grab a hold of the gimbal bearing so you can pull it out. See that extension? Now I can no longer compress that tip. So I'll pull that out. Here's what it looks like. Nothing too fancy. And on the opposite end of the shaft is machine cuts where you can apply a wrench to turn or rotate this entire shaft to allow you to pull the gimbal bearing out. What I want to do now is compress the tip, and it may not be super easy, but we'll do our best to try. There we go. At this point, the gimbal bearing is on the shaft, and you'll notice where it catches. See that? However, if I don't use this extension rod, as we apply that force to remove the gimbal bearing from the housing or insert, it may slip off the gimbal bearing, disrupting your pull or removal process. So you'll just slam this in, and as I slam this in, you may notice that this grip portion extends. Just like that. However, I'll remove that. Take the gimbal bearing back off, and to do so, I'll just compress all these and pull it out. Next, I position the alignment tool. In DIYers, this is going to be an extremely important step before removing the current gimbal bearing inside your engine. You are going to use this entire alignment tool shaft, grab this portion or tool of the kit, slide that on the shaft, and you are going to slide this shaft all the way inside the engine and down the U-joint bellows, and you'll get to a point where you are then going to slide it through the current gimbal bearing installed inside your engine, and you will keep pushing this alignment tool in until it goes all the way inside the engine coupler located inside the engine on the inner portion of the hull, and you will wait until it comes to a complete stop or bottoms out against the inner wall or stopping point of that engine coupler. And at that point, you want to make a mark on your shaft here. So when it comes time to install the brand new gimbal bearing, you have your proper placement for your exact engine. And say for example it bottoms out right here and I've made my mark, I will then shift this hole up, insert a pen, pencil, marker, whatever you want to use to make a dot. I'll slide that off. What most people do is they position this carefully inside a vise and drill the hole. At that point, you put this tool back on and you shoot this screw all the way through the shaft where it connects to the backside thread here and secures this tool in place. However, DIYers, we will not have that luxury, because when we were removing our outdrive from the boat, unfortunately, the old gimbal bearing corroded and rusted so bad that it seized to the actual U-joint assembly shaft, which is not what is supposed to happen. And I'll show you a picture of it right now. Back to our rebuilt outdrive, and as you can see, the brand new U-joint assembly and shaft and inner crossbars. Big difference, huh? Let's head out to the boat and get started. Inside the garage now, and we are working on an Alpha 1 Gen 1 1989, and as you can see, our outdrive has been fully removed from the bell housing and assembly. Coming inside, you will notice all the grease, which is a good thing, and that is the internal portion, again, of the bell housing and the U-joint assembly bellows. And if you scroll further in, you can see the seal that is positioned behind the gimbal bearing. Again, in our case, our gimbal bearing is already removed from the internal portion of our engine. It's stuck to the shaft when we remove the outdrive. And if we continue scrolling in, you can see the actual splines inside the engine coupler. And let me grab the Browning Buckmark flashlight to see if we can get a little light inside there, as you see. Again, that is the engine coupler installed inside the actual engine. Next, grab your alignment tool shaft and this portion of the kit and position that on the alignment shaft. And you are going to carefully insert the shaft through the bell housing and into the U-joint assembly bellows and through the current gimbal bearing installed, as well as past the seal that's behind the gimbal bearing, and continue pushing this shaft all the way in until not only this tool here is flush with the current gimbal bearing installed, but this portion of the shaft is all the way inside and flush with the most inward or rear portion of the engine coupler. In other words, this tip right here will end up being flush with the back or inner portion of the coupler, and this portion here will be flush with the current gimbal bearing installed. So keep pushing that all the way in until those two are flush with one another, and at that point you will gently and ever so carefully remove the shaft from the insert, and you will make your marking. And what I recommend doing is clean the shaft and tool of the grease and repeat that process maybe 3 to 4 times to ensure that every single time you perform this step and pull the shaft out, your marking is in the exact same spot. And if it is, you can safely and confidently move forward with the removal process of your current gimbal bearing. Next, if you have not already, go ahead and carefully remove the 4 nuts and washers on these 4 threaded studs. Set those aside. Grab your removal tool, carefully remove the protective sleeve that again protects the thread on the shaft. And DIYers, this is very greasy here, so be careful. Set that aside, and I'm going to remove this portion of the tool. Set that aside as well. And again, DIYers, this is simulation. Our gimbal bearing is not actually inside this engine. From here, go ahead and compress the tip as much as you can with your hand, and carefully slide this down the gimbal housing and through the U-joint bellows, and position the tip with the hole of the current gimbal bearing installed, and just kind of carefully wiggle this tool or shaft until you have verified that the back portion of the gimbal bearing is now inside this lip on the tool itself. And you can basically kind of pull it back and forth, and I'll grab our current gimbal bearing and I'll install it. And again, simulation. That's what you want it to look like. And it's going to be inside here. I'll just carefully shift this inside here. Again, this is simulation. Next, you will grab this plate and you will shift it onto the shaft, and you'll begin screwing it on. And continue screwing this on until basically you've got tension on the plate itself and that inner machine cut on the tip of this shaft. And from there, install your 4 washers and nuts on the threaded studs. And at this point, before you tighten it any further, you want to grab this shaft that again extends the tip of this shaft and really locks that machine cut lip to the back side of the bearing carrier to allow it to pull it out. And when inserting this, it might be a little tough, so you got to apply some pretty friendly taps to properly set this tool all the way flush with this point here. And again, this circular portion will actually go inside this part of the shaft. And here's the stopping point or machine cut that doesn't allow this tool to go any further in. We're not going to pound this through, but in your case you will, because again, you want it to lock to the back side of the gimbal bearing. Next, the machine cuts for your wrench, and you are going to begin turning this counterclockwise. And as you turn this counterclockwise, the tension on the gimbal bearing and plate will become greater. And at that point, go ahead and carefully tighten all of your nuts to a point where the actual threaded stud is flush with the outer or top portion of the nut. And after doing that to all 4 nuts, back to the wrench, and again, counterclockwise turning on the shaft. And it may take about 5 minutes of turning. You will continue turning, and the tension will continue to get greater as this shaft begins to pull that gimbal bearing out. And sooner or later, you will get to a point where this shaft will become easier to unscrew. And at that point, that is your indication that the gimbal bearing is further out than in. And just carefully unscrewing this until you can look inside and see that the gimbal bearing has been removed from the insert. From there, go ahead and remove your 4 nuts and washers. You can either pull your extension rod out at this time or right before you remove the nuts and washers. It may be easier to remove this extension rod with the nuts and washers still installed on these threaded studs. However, in our case, I'll just pull it out, set that aside, and carefully pull not only the shaft, but the plate that's on the thread out. And you will notice your gimbal bearing will actually be positioned like that. And from here, without getting grease on anything, I'm going to carefully unscrew the plate from the shaft. And really, you don't have to remove this plate from the shaft. You can store it like this. However, if you want to store it in a much compact manner as it came in the box, I'd recommend removing this plate. And at this point, because we removed the extension rod, it allows this tip to collapse and your gimbal bearing may fall as shown here. And DIYers, from here, it is a little tricky to get the old gimbal bearing off because it can't go this way because this portion of the shaft is too large for the gimbal bearing to slide over. And that is by design because the manufacturer that designed this does not want anyone sliding a gimbal bearing over this thread and damaging the thread, ultimately ruining the entire tool. That would not be good. So you've got two options. If you're strong enough, go and push your gimbal bearing all the way up and pinch down on these three portions here of the shaft and manually collapse this portion here. And as you do that, simultaneously pull the gimbal bearing off. However, if you're trying to do that and it's not going well, I'll show you a friendly DIY trick that makes it easier to remove this gimbal bearing from the shaft. We're back inside and I have reinstalled the protective sleeve that slides onto the shaft and protects the thread. And here is a better view of that extension rod. When we were in the garage and at the boat, this is what I was talking about. You want it pushed all the way in and flush, which will allow those three grip teeth to not be able to collapse or shift in and weaken the grip on the gimbal bearing as you pull it out. So again, make sure that that is flushed. What I'll do now is remove that extension bar. And again, I'm going to show you a friendly way to get this gimbal bearing off because right now it won't come off. Here is just a normal clamp that I purchased from our local AutoZone. And all I'm going to do is shift this on here and I am going to press this in place and begin screwing it tight. And I'll push the gimbal bearing up and I'll grab my ratchet and socket, and right now this is a 5/16. And at this point the clamp is beginning to tighten flush with the shaft and we are no longer able to slide it, and we recommend sliding it as far up as you can, but this is good enough for us. And we will continue tightening this, and what that's going to do as we tighten that clamp, it is going to compress all three of those grips or teeth to a point where you can pull the gimbal bearing right off as shown there. And that is extremely easy. All I have to do now is loosen up the clamp and remove it. DIYers, that is a very easy way to do it. Taking a step back, and DIYers, that is it. Hopefully the video helped. Hey, scrolling above right now is a video link that basically picks up right where we left off, which will include the bellow replacement, the shift cables, and trim centers. So if you're interested in continuing to join us through our rebuild project, we'd love to see you there. Do us a favor, below the video, you will see that thumbs up icon. Click on that, like the video, subscribe to the channel, definitely ring your YouTube bell. That would be very helpful to us. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for watching.